Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about Greek civilization, starting with some of our early Greek civilizations, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, and then we'll get into Athens and some general things about Greek culture and so on. So we're going to get started first with the geography of Greece, something that's going to impact how this society develops over time. So, the first thing you should know about Greece is that it is a peninsula, which is an area of land almost completely surrounded by water and connected to the mainland by a narrow strip of land. And you also see a lot of smaller peninsulas and islands all throughout uh, the area of Greece. So, we've got the Greek peninsula, the main one here. And then we have a bunch of smaller little peninsulas. Here's one. We've got like some fingers coming off here, smaller peninsulas. So there's all kinds of peninsulas, and then, of course, tons of little islands all throughout the Aegean Sea and Ionian Sea here that all makes up Greece. Okay. Now, you can also probably tell from this map that Greece is very mountainous. Lots of mountainous terrain all throughout the peninsula. And so a lot of these smaller little peninsulas are going to be cut off from the mainland because of this mountainous terrain. There's not going to be a lot of room for farming either. And so this type of geography is really going to promote trade and colonization for the Greeks in the Mediterranean basin. They're going to be trading all throughout the Aegean Sea with a lot of the other smaller islands, and then all throughout the Mediterranean basin, as far as Sicily down to Egypt, with the Middle East over here, and with the Asia Minor region there. We're also going to see very unique customs and beliefs developing in each individual Greek community. So, the society in Athens, Greece, for example, is going to be very different than what we see in Sparta or Olympia or so on. Okay, you can see Mount Olympus up here as well, which is going to be key for some of our religious beliefs that we get here in Greece as well. And then one other impact of the geography is that it makes it very difficult to unify the Greek people. So we're going to see a lot of warfare between some of these different societies in Greece. We have another map here of ancient Greece. The green areas are the settled areas that we're going to be talking about. So, not the whole entire peninsula at this point, but a couple of things I just want to draw your attention to that we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start with the island of Crete, which is where our Minoan civilization is going to be located. We're also going to be talking about Athens today. We'll mention Mount Olympus and the city of Troy here in Asia Minor. All right, so that's going to be playing a part as well as the Aegean Sea. Okay, so the Minoan civilization, our first major civilization in Greece, it goes from about 3000 BCE to 1100 BCE, so before Common Era. This is going to be during the Bronze Age. The Minoans lived on that island of Crete, that big island to the south of the mainland of Greece, and they developed a sea trade network that dominated the Aegean Sea. So they're going to be trading with the mainland of Greece, all those little Greek islands, Egypt, and Sicily. And they also had a pretty advanced culture. They had a writing system. They built the city of Knossos, which had a big palace at it, and they worshipped goddesses and had their own belief system. Eventually, the Minoan civilization declines, probably due to an invasion by the Mycenaeans, who are going to be our next civilization. The Mycenaeans were at the height of their power around 1400 BCE, and they controlled the Aegean Sea and parts of the Mediterranean. And they spread their power through conquest, which you can kind of see here represented on this pottery, the different Mycenaean soldiers probably marching in somewhere to conquer it. They used their own system of writing and spoke an early form of the Greek language, which is going to go on to influence a lot of what we see in language today. They also blended the island cultures with the mainland cultures. So we're starting to see some unity and continuity between the different Greek civilizations that is going to sort of unify them under this ancient Greece umbrella. And a big story that comes out of the Mycenaean civilization is this myth of a trade struggle between Greece and Troy. And that eventually evolves into the story of the Trojan War. Now, a major famous event from the Trojan War was the Greeks conquering Troy with the use of what is called the Trojan horse. Basically, the Greeks presented a large wooden horse that they had built, and they built it as a gift to the Trojans. And they came up to the gate of Troy and they said, "Here you go, Trojans. We have this gift for you." And so the Trojans bring this giant horse into their city. But what they didn't know was that some of the Greek soldiers were hiding in the belly of the horse, just camping out, waiting for nightfall. So the Trojans bring the horse in, and then the Greeks sneak out of the horse and let the rest of the Greek army in through the gates. And the Greeks are able to take the city, kill a bunch of people, destroy it, and that is how they conquer and win the Trojan War. So it's a really famous story from that time. Now, the story of the Trojan War is written down in two places. One is in the story of the Iliad, which actually tells the story of the Trojan War, and then the Odyssey as well, which is a story of one of the soldiers, Odysseus, who leaves Troy on his way back home. To get back home after the war. And so the Odyssey is all about that journey of Odysseus. And along the way, he encounters different Greek gods, different mythological creatures, and we learn about Odysseus, we learn about the different gods and other heroes. And so these stories teach the Greeks about some of their actual history mixed in with some of their myths. And these stories are both credited to the poet Homer, although they weren't written down right away. So the actual author is a little fuzzy, but we still accredit those two stories to Homer. Now, Greece enters into a period of dark ages from about the 1100s to 750 BCE. It's kind of the opposite of a golden age where you have a lot of prosperity. In a dark age, in Greece particularly, we have widespread poverty and a decline in trade, so some economic difficulties for Greece during this period. Uh, they abandoned their writing in favor of oral traditions, so kind of getting rid of the writing that they had developed. And a lot of people moved to farmlands, had to leave their homes, trying to get food and trying to make their way during this dark age. We also get Acropolis. This is a fortified hill of an ancient Greek city, so a lot of walls being built up for protection during this time as well. Again, I said a lot of the Greek civilizations and communities are going to be warring with one another. Right. Now, we get a couple of different types of governments throughout the history of ancient Greece. Just like what we saw in Mesopotamia, hundreds of cities developed into city states. So we have cities that have their own government, they have their own way of life. Those are going to be what we see in Greece as well. Now, a lot of these city states are going to start with an aristocracy, and that's going to eventually evolve into a tyranny, and then finally the stage of democracy, which Greece is kind of famous for. So, beginning with aristocracy, the earliest form of government in the city states was usually a chieftain or a king. So you had power being passed from father to son in a hereditary fashion, in like a monarchy type situation. But those families are going to become very powerful, and they're going to become the aristocrats, members of the rich and powerful families who power is passing down through. So these aristocrats are going to control the best land, horses, and weapons, and have control of these city states. Now, eventually, as trade and wealth was building up, merchants and artisans were able to sort of harness some of that wealth and power through their trade relationships. And so we start to see a shift of military strength from the aristocrats to the middle class, who are going to then overthrow the aristocratic government and take over. And so we're going to get a tyrant ruling in different parts of Greece. A tyrant is someone, a ruler who takes power by force. And that's what we call a tyranny. Sometimes we call it a dictatorship or a totalitarian government. They're not exactly the same as each other, but they're very similar, kind of in that same vein of forced rule. Then eventually we will evolve into a democracy. People will decide that they want to control the government for themselves. And so they overthrow their harsh tyrants and replace their governments with democracy, which is government uh, by the people. Citizens govern themselves. In Athens, only men could be citizens. So women aren't voting, women aren't making important decisions. If you were a slave as well, you weren't involved in government. So that's going to be only men who are voting. And they're going to have what is called a direct democracy. So everyone who is eligible to vote will be voting for different policies and laws being passed. As opposed to a representative democracy, which is like what we have here in America, where citizens aren't necessarily voting for every single law that goes through Congress. Our elected representatives are making those decisions on our behalf. So that's one major difference of some different democracies that we'll see. Now, Athens is going to be a major player in the history of ancient Greece. And they're most known for this golden age that they go through from 479 to 431 BCE. And the golden age is going to be marked first with their wealth. They make a lot of their wealth through trade. They have silver mines, and they're also collecting tribute from weaker areas around them. So a tribute is a regular payment made to a powerful state or nation by a weaker one. So surrounding communities are going to be sending tribute in the form of silver, gold, different items that could be traded, different bounties, things like that are going to be the tributes collected by the Athenians. And so that's going to bring a lot of wealth to their society. And with wealth, you can do a lot of things. You can build infrastructure, you can maintain stability, you can fund the arts and education, things like that. So we're going to see all those things in Athens during this golden age. Now, a key figure in Athens was Pericles. He was the most powerful man in Athenian politics, well educated, intelligent, and very persuasive. And he uses his position as an aristocrat to help to introduce reforms to strengthen democracy in Athens. So we're going to see a lot of stability in the government of Athens as well as wealth. And of course, those are perfect for a golden age. Now, one of the most famous things that comes out of ancient Greece is their religious beliefs. People are very familiar with a lot of the stories of the Greek gods and so on. There are 12 Olympians, which come from a family of gods and goddesses in ancient Greece. And each of these gods have different powers. They have control over different areas of human life. So, for example, Hera is the goddess of marriage and women. And they also control parts of the natural world. So a god like Poseidon has control of the sea. He's the god of the sea, water, and earthquakes. And a lot of these mythical stories surrounding the gods are there simply to explain why things happen. If we're in ancient times and we don't have the scientific knowledge that explains why the tides happen, we might say, "Oh, it's the god Poseidon bringing the tides in and out." When really the tides are impacted by the moon, which we now know through our scientific advancements. So these myths help people understand the world around them and also help preserve a lot of their histories. Some stories were about their own heroes, people like Odysseus or Achilles, and taught different lessons and taught them about the gods and what they were meant to do. The Greeks built a lot of temples as well to honor and worship their gods. Gods would have their own individual temples, so there might be a temple to Athena or a temple to Apollo. There would be different temples there with different characteristics and sculptures that would help to tell the story of those gods. And the gods also had human characteristics. They were jealous, they were greedy, they had different vices and things like that. But they were also very powerful and immortal. So they could kind of do what they want, and they sort of interfered with life on Earth for their own entertainment. Of course, one of the most powerful gods in Greek mythology is the god Zeus, who ruled all of the gods and men from his kingdom on Mount Olympus. And so the Greeks would have a festival and games every 4 years to honor the god Zeus. And this is what eventually becomes the Olympics. So we get a lot of really famous things that come out of ancient Greece. And then finally, about their religious beliefs, we have oracles, which are sacred sites in ancient Greece where a god or a goddess would be consulted. So, say the Athenians were about to go to war with Sparta or something like that. They would go to an oracle and seek the advice of the gods about what they should do, what they should bring with them, maybe get predictions about the future, about who is going to win the battle. Is it worth it to go into this war or whatever? So they would use the oracles to help guide them through different endeavors. And a really famous example of an oracle is at Delphi. It was dedicated to Apollo. So different oracle sites might be specific to different gods as well. Now, not everyone subscribed to the mythology the way that many Greeks did. You get some philosophers during this time, people who believed they could use powers of the mind and reason to understand the natural events happening around them rather than depending on those myths. So, we're looking at science and philosophy to help us understand the world and get truth and facts rather than just myths. So, a couple of really famous philosophers, Thales, he believed that water was the basic material of all life, which is pretty close to the truth. Democritus, who thought everything was made out of atoms, which Einstein will later expand on. We also had sophists, who were skilled speakers who debated topics in public. So people were educated by these different public debates and learned through the studies of the philosophers. Another really famous philosopher was Socrates. He discussed wisdom, goodness, and challenged a lot of the beliefs of the Athenians, which actually ended up angering them. They finally brought him to trial and sentenced him to death by suicide. Hemlock in 399 BCE. So he ended up dying for his beliefs. But he was also a big scholar and taught a lot of other philosophers, namely Pluto, who was a student of Socrates. Plato, I'm sorry, not Pluto. Plato mistrusted democracy, and so he wrote a book called The Republic, looking at new forms of government to explore. He also founded the Academy, which was a center for learning. Another student of Plato was Aristotle, a famous astronomer. He was a student of Plato and founded the Lyceum, so another learning center. And he believed that reason should guide our pursuit of knowledge rather than myths. So, again, an emphasis on science, study, and observation rather than those myths. And then finally, the arts flourished in ancient Greece. We're going to get a lot of really interesting architecture that influences architecture all over the Western world. If you look at this picture here of the Parthenon, probably looks similar to a lot of the buildings that we see in our own capital of Washington, D.C. You'll see these columns show up. And a lot of that is modeled after the architecture of ancient Greece. Now, the Parthenon in particular was a temple built to honor the goddess Athena, totally made of marble. It was built at the new Acropolis, which was the center of Athens. So it's at one of the highest points in Athens. So you can see it from really far away. And it housed a giant statue of Athena, which was made out of ivory and gold. And then all along the outside, all along these ledges here, up at the top, this is in ruins now, but there were all kinds of statues and sculpted scenes on the inside and the outside of the Parthenon, full of action. And they showed the balance between order and peace in ancient Greece. And a lot of the artwork was very lifelike and accurate. So human anatomy was very realistic, but it was also very idealistic. So all of the men would be shown as very muscular, whereas not all men are very muscular. So it's kind of showing that ideal, that perfection that people would strive towards. The Greeks were also famous for the dramatic arts. So, performing different stories that would be written down for actors to then perform for audiences. There were two types, tragedies and comedies. A tragedy is a type of serious drama that usually ends in disaster for the main character, whereas a comedy is going to be more lighthearted. It's going to make fun of maybe well known citizens and politicians and different customs that you might have. So something like you see on Saturday Night Live or something like that. Now, the performances were usually part of dramatic festivals, and they would have contests. People would vote for their favorites, and the different actors would be rewarded by the people who enjoyed them. So, a lot of really interesting things come out of ancient Greece here. Next week, we're going to be looking more closely at Athens and Sparta, and wrapping things up with Alexander the Great. All right.